So first of all, just for letting you know how next week will work. So you will have a lesson on designing for the web, that is information architecture and visual design. This has to do with the most design part of the web application implementation. And you will have that lesson both on Monday and on the first hour of Tuesday. As I told you before, it is super useful for the midterm assignment because Professor De Russis will give you some guidelines, some formal guidelines on how to deal with the fonts, with the colors, with the spacing, with the typography. So it's something that I'm willing you to integrate into the midterm assignment. Of course, since the midterm assignment is here, I'm not expecting you to integrate all of that because you won't have that much time, but to give you some time to work on that, we will devote the second hour of the next Tuesday and the lab for trying to integrate as much as possible from what you learn on this session into the midterm assignment, okay? Okay. So let's now see it in practice. How does this authentication works? So I'm starting from what we did last week, from the exercise that we did last week. So first of all, let's run the application. So here we had our application. So now I propose you to implement this sign-in functionality, okay? Okay, let's do it from the front end back to the back end. So last time we said that we have the registration, and for the registration we were expecting the name, the username, the email, and the password, and our database was consistent with these fields that we set here in the front end. Now we want to create the sign-in, that in this case should be asking the user the email and the password to check if the user has the access to the application. So let me very quickly create the form. This one is pretty similar to the registration. Indeed, it's better login. Okay, in this case, for the login, we won't be uploading files, so we can delete this one, for instance. Are you able to see the code back there? There in the back, can you see the code? It's fine there? Okay. Okay, we won't need the name and the surname, but we will just need the email and the password. And in this case, we won't be uploading the picture, and then we will have the submit, right? Okay, because here, okay. Let me change the name of this one so that we keep everything consistent. So not sign in, but login. Here we can call this one login. So that we keep consistent the vocabulary just by calling this login. Okay, so now we have this new page that is the sign-in page. That should not be. Okay, the login page, and we have the form to authenticate. That it has the username and the password. Okay. Nice. And maybe the last thing that we can do with the information that we have now is to create the root for the authentication. No, it should be something similar to this. Let's go this one, authenticate. Authenticate. And up to now, we will just say that this will redirect to the home. Okay, so up to now, our form, when we submit the form, it will first do the first verifications to check that the email address has been included. If we add something that is not the email address, then it will ask us to write something as an email address, so here. And the same for the password. If we don't insert the password, he will ask us for a password. So I know that we already have seen this, but it's important to show that the validations and the verification should be done starting from the front end, okay? Okay, okay, and the method is not allowed for the URL because we haven't implemented the function. No, I'm sorry, it's not allowed because here we should not be calling register, but we should be calling not login, but authenticate. Why with login it doesn't work? Because this login is a get method. And for submitting the information of a form, we need a post method. So this one is able to gather the information that we submit because it's a post method. This one doesn't because it's a get method and it's just to retrieve the page, okay? Let's organize a little bit this file so that we have here sign up and register, and here below we have login and authenticate. And then we had the okay, so far so good. We haven't done anything new, so we're done. Okay, so let's take a look to the slides, and based on the order that I propose in the slides, let's try to implement the new functionality. So we basically said that the first step was to install Flask login. So I will stop the application, and it should be something like pip install Flask. Okay, in my case, since I already have the module, the library installed, it will say me that the requirement is already satisfied. In your case, I suppose that it has shown Flask login has just been installed, something like that. Okay, so this one, check. And then we have to set up the Flask login, the setting up of the Flask login library. So here, as you can see, the first step is to go to the app.py and import login manager, okay? So here in our app.py, we will say from Flask okay, so we have just imported the login manager. Then for our specific application, we have to set this property, that is app.config and for the secret key. So here below the flask.name, we have to specify what will be the script that we will be using for encoding the secret key or the session ID that a Flask login will be dealing with. So this is something arbitrary, so key for the imparato okay, and then we will initialize login manager, and we will initialize login manager by writing these two lines here. So login manager equal login manager, create this variable login manager, and then we initialize such variable with by passing the app as a parameter. Okay. Nice. So now I did that and the application doesn't work. Why it doesn't work? From the message we are getting from the exception. Because we are missing the user loader. No? Do you remember that there are two things that we have to set up or to configure here? One is the user model and the other one is the user loader function. So here, if we don't define the user loader function, it won't work. So login manager for working needs that function to be specified. Otherwise, it can't be initialized. So first of all, we have to create the user model and then the user loader callback. In the user model, we know it's something like this. But once again, to keep the concerns separated and the responsibilities split across different classes and different files, here what we will do is to create a new file that can be called models.python, for instance. And in that new file that is models.python, we will define our user model. Okay, so does this user model attributes match with the ones of the Imparato applications? Because these are the ones that I copied from the slide. But do they match with the ones that we have defined for our application? Maybe yes, because if we take a look at the database and how we defined our users, they have an ID a name, surname, email, password, and they have a profile image. So we're missing that one, the profile image. So self. I don't know if it is already clear that here we define all of the attributes that a user in our application might have, because then when user login manager, we will have the chance to say authenticated user dot and ask any of these attributes. So from now on, for instance, if we want to get the profile image of the user that is authenticated, we will say authenticated user dot profile image. Why it will work? Because we have defined here in this model. So we are specifying login manager, what a user in our application have, which are the attributes, so that when login manager will manage our users, we can ask him, okay, since you know which one is the authenticated user, and since you know that a user in my application has a profile image, please give me the profile image of the user that is currently authenticated. Okay. So this is the sense and the reason for creating these models. Okay, are we missing something? No? So we created the user model, and then we will create the login manager function. So this decorator is to indicate that the function below is the one that corresponds to the user loader. Did we already had like something get by email, but we don't have get by ID? So here we have to create a new function to get a user given its ID. Select everything from users. So that now we can say okay, so here we are getting the user from the database by using the function that we have defined into the user's DAO, in the user's DAO file. That is the one that retrieves us the whole user by its ID. Okay. But here we don't know if the database or if such user was found in the database. So we have to consider both cases. The cases in which that user existed and we got something from the database, and the case in which such user didn't exist, okay? So here we are creating a new object, a new instance of that user model that we have just created. But in order to be able to do that, we have to import import the user we have just created, okay? That is this one. It was, sorry, in the database it was name, surname, and in the model, okay, it's name, it's in English. Okay, so once again, why are we doing this? I'm sorry for being so persistent with this, but if we understand this point of the development, we're done. Here we are saying login manager each time that you want to do something with a user, if each time that you want to manage a user, here is the way how you can load the user in my application. And here is the way that you can get the data from a user in my application. What's the way? You have to ask for the database to get all of the information for a specific user by ID. And you have to create a new model using all of the data that we got from the database. Okay? So we are creating a new instance of this user model with this data. If what the database retrieved as is not known, meaning that it found a user, we create a new one and we assign it to our user variable. Otherwise, we set user to known, and at the end, we return the user. Okay? Is this part clear? So now it doesn't retrieve, it doesn't show the same error because now we have defined the user loader function. Okay, so if when you are creating or implementing this part of the application, the authentication, and it throws that error, is because the user loader function hasn't been defined. And now let's try to implement the login. That is this function that we haven't. Okay. Here, there is this function that I think we haven't used so far, that is toDict. That is basically to transform all of the data that we got from the request into a dictionary so that we can easily manipulate all of the data coming into the post request. Okay. So on the form user, we're getting the data coming from the form. And then how do you think we will implement this functionality of authentication? What should we do? We already have the information that the client has passed us, which is the email and the password that he wants to authenticate with. Now, what should we do? How would you implement the authentication? I'm giving you my email and my password. What is the first thing that on the server you would try to do? Okay, see if there is a match with information. I mean, are we going to check the match in a single operation, or are we going to do some different verifications? Yeah?
I don't know if it makes sense, but could we do something like get password by email to see if it matches the email that the user is?
Yeah, so at some point I think there will be like the verification to check if the password matches. Okay. Yeah, that is the one that you are telling me, right? To see if the password matches with the corresponding user. Okay, yeah? And before that one?
Maybe we can do a query to check if the email exists in the database.
Yeah.
If it does, we check the password. Okay.
Sure. So in that, I suggest that one because we can try to identify two possible paths, no? One of them is when the user doesn't exist, so it doesn't make any sense to try to log in. And it usually happens as when we try to log in an application, and if we haven't created an account, he says as your user doesn't exist. So the first one would be to check if the user exists, and once we know that the user exists, then we proceed to check if the password matches, okay? So that's like the two steps that we could implement in this case. So I'm using this variable name to distinguish from the information that we are getting from the form and the information that we are getting from the data. So let's call this one here we need a function. Okay, here I created a function to get the user by email because it's the data that I currently have available on that user. So get user by email. So from the email form, and I don't know if we called okay, yeah, since we call this txt email, here the way to get that data is txt email. Okay, and here the first Name, user, surname, the email, password. And here, apart from importing the loading manager, I will import the functions that I will use, for instance, to log in the user, no? So what I'm doing in this case, if the user doesn't exist, well, in this case we will just print in the console, we will print the user doesn't exist, and we will redirect for the home. But if the user exists in the database, if I found a user that has such email, what will I do? What is my approach here? Create an instance of the user model object, of the user model, an object from this class, an instance, and then instead of doing the authentication by hand, instead of checking everything by hand, I just invoke this function that belongs to Flask login, passing as a parameter the user that I have just instantiated. Do you remember that this login user function this login user function retrieves true if the login attempt succeeds, and false if it fails. So what we might do here is if okay, well, let's try to check if it works. In Imparato, we just have one user. We have two users with these emails and with these passwords. So this one should work with. Okay, so for instance, let's say. So here, for instance, when I try with a user that doesn't exist on the database, we should expect this to fail because he couldn't find a user based on this email that I have submitted. Okay, so send. And up to now, here it prints the user doesn't exist. Of course, then we will implement all of the visual part to inform the user that what happened. But up to now, just for the sake of the development, we will rely on these messages printed in the console. So the user doesn't exist. Now let's try the login again with a user that exists, but with the wrong password. So for instance, this one exists, but with a random password. And it broke because this user didn't have, at the moment, do you remember that when we created this user, the profile image was optional? And on the other case, we are expecting that profile image to be mandatory. So since this one doesn't have anything on that field, it fails because it expects the user to be built with a profile image. So let's try with the second one. No, and also because when we are creating this one, we are not setting. Okay, the mistake was that in the model, we defined that the user had a profile image, and here, when we created the instance of that model, we were not passing this profile image information. Okay, so we knew that in any case we would be redirected to the main page, but let's see on the let me why is it working? Check because this verification is Okay. Uh, Okay, so I was missing here an additional verification because we were just checking if the user existed in the database, but we were missing the validation of the password, no? So here we're saying if the user doesn't exist or if the password in the form is different from the password in the database, then something went wrong. Since I told you before that we want maybe to distinguish between the two cases, we could do if the user doesn't exist as a here, something there as elif we could be doing something like this first to check if the user exists in the database. If he exists, then if he doesn't exist, then we directly say he doesn't exist. Then in this case, if that's okay, no, in this case it throws out. Then if the form user is different in the one that we got from the form, from the one that we have in the database, then we can know that in this case the password is wrong. Otherwise, we know that the user exists and that the password is correct. In whose case we create the new user and we basically say we ask Flask login to authenticate the user by using its function. Okay. Is this clear? Is that function clear? Let's see if it works. So okay, the user doesn't exist. Okay. In this case, one problem is that the user doesn't exist, but also we knew the password was wrong. Let's see the other case in which the user exists, but the password is wrong. And here we have the password is wrong. And then finally we have the case in which we have true because the login function was true. And at that point, we know that the user is authenticated. So the user has been already logged in. Let me try something because I don't want to always show that. I mean, I don't want to manage everything with console messages. So let me try something. Okay, but before, no, because I wanted to show you how to show visually a message here to indicate that. But let me quickly. So we already log in the user, and now since we are letting Flask manage to manage the specific user, we can do things like this one, and you tell me if this makes sense to you. Login register. Let's try it here. Okay, do you see what I did here? Now within my base.html file, using the Jinja syntax, I can ask for this current user. Why does this current user variable now exist? Because it's something that Flask login manages for me. So now I can say, ask questions such as this. If the current user is authenticated, then show here its username. Let's delete this one. Show his username. And if I come here to the application, we have just authenticated, so it shows my username. What else we can do, what makes a lot of sense, is doing the same thing as here. Or you tell me what I will do. If the current user is authenticated, then I want that if the user is authenticated, then give me a chance to log out. Okay? This one makes only sense if the user has already authenticated. So here I add the logout button, and what I want is, no, not this, but to create the logout function in here. So here I will create a function for the logout that I named logout. Why do you think we have this line here? Because it's a decorator indicating that that function can be, or it's a function that requires the user to be logged in that moment. Why? Because it doesn't make any sense to try to log out if you are not already logged in. So it's not just to protect the roots, but also in this case of the logout is to make sure that the user has been authenticated. Why do we see the decorator with the warnings? Because we have to import it here. Logout user. And we have to import also the login required. Okay, so now if I come here to log out, okay, it logged out. And when it logged out, it automatically removed these two links because these two links that were there were dependent on the fact that the current user is authenticated. Now if I try again, something like and I authenticate, now I see Juan, and I see again the logout function. In this case, for instance, does it make sense to have the login button? No, because if I'm logged out, so how do we delete that button? Here in the first condition, if, I don't know if this is the right syntax. Okay, so if the user is authenticated, meaning that if not the current user is authenticated, meaning that the user is authenticated, then I don't show the login button, for instance. Okay, and of course we can do it for each section of the website. So, for instance, if I don't know. Because, for instance, all of this data is data that makes sense when a user is authenticated, no? For instance, become a tutor makes sense if I am already authenticated. That was what we were trying to do the last time. So we can apply the same logic there and say, show me find a tutor, become a tutor. So show me this portion of the website. This one, if the user is authenticated, so that when I log out, it doesn't show me anymore that specific portion of the website. Is it enough to hide the links and the buttons? No, it is not enough. So what do we do to protect specific functionalities of the website? Other than hiding them from the visual interface, we can add this login required decorator so that, for instance, if I come here to for instance, my history. So let's suppose that it doesn't make sense to show the history of a user that is not authenticated. It requires to be authenticated to show his history. So we can set that this function is just for authenticated users, for authorized users. So we add the decorator login required, meaning that now when here from the web page, when we click on history, it shows that it is unauthorized. Of course, we can set this to show a better message and to show a error page formatted with our criteria, but here it says that it blocks that functionality from being accessible and from being usable from the user. So it is not just by hiding the elements on the graphical interface, but it is also by blocking the routes and by setting the routes to be login required in order to be usable. And the same thing here. So we already blocked the functionality here, but now in the base we can also set this condition. My favorites, my announcements, who are we? History. So well, this one and this one. Are links that are just available when the user login. Okay, so become a tutor and history is just available in that case. Just one last thing. Okay. Here. Password. Let me quickly check if this works, because something else that I wanted to show you today. Okay, log out. Let's try to register. Ah. Okay, so here, what was that? The last thing that I want to show you today. So here in the app.py, that was the last slide that I was showing you, that we can use a library that is able for creating the hash for the passwords, because we will never save the passwords plain in the database. We will always do some kind of encryption, and then we save the password with a specific encryption. So in this case, we use this generate password hash function that belongs to this library, that is the one referred in the slides. And what changes? It changes that in the moment of creating the user, we don't use the password coming from the form as it comes to create the user, as we have done so far, because, for instance, so far we simply got that value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we save that value as it was in the database. But instead of that, we call this function generate password hash, and what we store in the database is the password hash that it has created. So the database should always look, the password in the database should always look as something like this. What does this imply? That using this generate password hash, it also means that since we hash the password, how are we going to check then the password is correct? Because the user won't enter the hashed password. The user will always enter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then we have to check that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 with the hash one. But then we have to do the opposite process, no? Get the hash one, make it become like the plain one, and then compare. Where are we going to do that comparison? In the login function. So in the authenticate in our case, and in that case we won't do anymore the comparison like this, because in this we are presuming that both passwords, the one saved in the database and the other one, is plain. This one remains plain because it's the one that the user inserts, but the other one doesn't. So So now, instead of doing the plain comparison, we use this function that is check password hash to check if the hashed password saved in the database is consistent with the data inserted from the user in the form. Just that in this case is the opposite. It's first the one in the database, the one that is hashed as the first parameter, and then the one that is in the form as the second, I think. I don't know which name did I give to, which password did I wrote. Okay, let me check if this one works. Okay, so in this case, you know it worked. So it means that we were able to save the hash password, and we were able to use to dehash the password to make the comparison and do the authentication. So now we have Alberto and it basically worked. Is it clear how the hash worked and how did we use the functions not to save the plain password but to save this one? Okay, questions? Yeah.
The last function to check the hash is probably the same library.
Yep, yeah. Here you have it. This one, check password hash. Yeah, that is from the same library. Any other questions? Okay, so once again, the Friday's lab will be on authentication to apply all of this. That's all. So we can stop here.